and you feel like you can stand for some other time, maybe just be considerate and offer your seat to someone.
Sorry, wait. I'm trying to record.
Oh, it looks like we have, oh, thank you so much. It looks like we have some more chairs.
Graduate student, I go to the city.
We'll be starting in about 3 minutes. Sorry.
I'm not trying to get on TV here, right? So
No, it's fine. And if you want to move back, but it should be okay right now.
Wilson and I are going to go to Columbia for 3 weeks.
There you are.
I'm taking it. Starting it, I paid for it. Now makes sense. You start like the small time drug deals, they just go to spending time. We talk about going somewhere.
Oh, no, I'm okay. I'm okay. No, I'm okay. No. A little obligated staff.
We originally, like, we're going to maybe
Coming out, Chris.
but
I've got it. No, I'm okay. I'm fine filming it.
Did you even sleep last night?
I slept 2 hours.
Oh, come on.
I know.
we can fly there with my mile. I know you're likely to test.
There's someone down there.
Oh, this is translated.
FedEx.
Oh, yeah, talking.
They sent me an email last week saying that because we already get a discount. Dear sir, we are not going to prosecute. But let me tell you what they did. Let me tell you what they did right before they did that. They gave me 200,000 miles. And then they dropped it. So now I have 400,000. That's a you can fly down there from trip 57,000. Wow.
All right, we're going to get started. So sorry for the commotion and the delay. I think there's some more seats back there in case you'd like to grab a chair. They're right back. So, I'm going to say a couple of words about Platypus, and then we're going to get started. You wanted to move the board over there. Okay, that's okay. Don't worry. I'll pick him out whenever you want. Okay. All right. It's okay. Let's get started. Okay. Thanks for your patience. So Platypus started back in 2007. We were first a reading group at the School of the Arts Institute of Chicago with graduates and undergraduates of both SAIC and the University of Chicago. And later we started putting together public fora. And our first public fora was called Imperialism, What is it and why should we be against it? And it was in the midst of the anti-war movement of the mid-2000s, where it was really confusing to be a leftist, because it was an anti-war movement, it was true, but there didn't seem to be an emancipatory force in the world that one would put one's strength and confidence behind. And so what did it mean to be on the left then? I think that all of us in Platypus have a pretty open-ended attitude about the possibility of creating a left in the present. I think what we do agree on is that one doesn't exist today. And so we put together these fora and hope that we can start a productive conversation. Our curatorial sensibilities is that we'd like to put together panelists who don't agree with each other in order to have a productive disagreement and conversation. So hopefully you all will be part of that during the Q&A. So a couple of things to get out of the way. We right now are in different cities. In fact, this is an international series of public fora that's starting in Chicago, and then it's going to continue in London, and then it will hit Chicago. So New York, London, Chicago. In the past, we've also done fora in Greece, in Germany, and I'm forgetting all of the countries that right now we are in. But if you want to find out more about Platypus, you can pick up a paper in the back or information and find out about all the things that we do. And we meet weekly, so you can join us at a coffee break or discussions, or you can just ask us. Feel free. Tomorrow there's an event that we are organizing at NYU because it's the 50th issue. We are at our 50th issue of the Platypus Review. This is our monthly publication, open to submission, and we're going to be celebrating at the Kindle at NYU, food, etc., and drinks after. Everyone is welcome. You can find out more about events, as I said, on the New York website, which is newyork.platypus1917.org, as well as on the pamphlets in the back that have listed all of our activities. We also have one last announcement. On December 6th, we're going to be hosting a roundtable discussion with some members of Jacobin Magazine, as well as other publications, on the issue of the election and democracy, and the continuation of the status quo in the next 4 years. So without further ado, let me introduce our moderator, and he will be telling you a little bit more about this event in particular, as well as introducing you to the panelists. Ross Wolf is a recent graduate of the University of Chicago. He's the author of a number of articles and essays in Soviet history, the architecture of high modernism, and Marxist political theory. His forthcoming book, The Graveyard of Utopia, Soviet Urbanism, and the Fate of the International Avant-Garde, is scheduled for release in spring 2013 from Zero Books. Ross has been a member of Platypus since 2009 and is currently one of the chapter organizers at the New School. And I just realized my name is Pam McGallis, just in case, and I am one of the coordinators in New York, and I also do the coordination in Europe. So, welcome.
Okay, so I'd like to, first of all, thank our panelists for coming out. I'd like to thank Spencer Leonard, Konstantin Kaminsky, Robert Curran, Alex Gleason for helping with the New School here, and Andoni Melithopoulos, our chapter head in Halifax. Okay, so to introduce the panelists first, alphabetically. Loren Goldner is a co-editor at Insurgent Notes, author of Ubu Saved in Spain, 1974 to 1977. The Sky is Always Darkest Just Before the Dawn, class struggle in the U.S. from the 2008 crash to the eve of Occupy. And more recently, Globalization of Capital, Globalization of Struggle. David Harvey is the Distinguished Professor of Anthropology and Geography at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author of The Condition of Postmodernity, and more recently, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, The Enigma of Capital and the Crises of Capitalism, and most recently, Rebel Cities, From the Right to the City to the Urban Revolution in 2012. Andrew Kliman is Professor of Economics at Pace University, contributing author to the Marxist Humanist Initiatives with Sober Senses since 2009, and author of Reclaiming Marxist Capital, A Refutation of the Myth of Inconsistency, and more recently, The Failure of Capitalist Production, Underlying Causes of the Great Recession. Paul Mattick teaches philosophy at Adelphi University and is a former editor of the International Journal of Political Economy from 1984 to 2004. He is also a frequent contributor to the Brooklyn Rail and author of Social Knowledge, an essay on nature and the limits of social science, Art in Its Time, Theories and Practices of Modern Aesthetics, and most recently, Business as Usual, The Economic Crisis and the Failure of Capitalism in 2011. Just to give an overview of the format for this panel, the format for the panel will be as follows. First, the panelists' introductory remarks, which will be prepared remarks addressing the specific questions posed and the general focus of the panel laid out in the event description, which appeared online. Following these 10 to 12 minute introductory remarks, the panelists will be allotted 2 minutes to respond to each other's statements. The third component will be the moderator's prerogative. I'll either pose additional questions raised by the discussion for clarification or expansion on specific remarks made by the panelists, or a second round of panelists' responses to each other's remarks and responses will be allowed. This will be 1 to 2 minutes per speaker. Finally, and we'd like this to be the most expansive section of the moderation and the event, the floor will be opened up for questions from the audience, which will comprise probably 30 to 40 minutes. Time permitting, then, the panelists will be granted another opportunity to offer some thoughts and conclusions, summarizing central points, clarifying points of disagreement, and etc. So 1 to 2 minutes per speaker. This event, Radical Interpretations of the Present Crisis, we formulated over the summer. And the way that we understood it was roughly as follows. That the present moment is arguably one of unprecedented confusion on the left. The emergence of many new theoretical perspectives on Marxism, anarchism, and the left more generally has seen the intellectual reflux of its final disintegration in history, rather than signs of a newfound vitality. As for the political groups that still bother to identify as leftists today, it seems no great merit that they remain so utterly aloof to the academic left's disputations over everything from imperialism to ecology. Perhaps nowhere are these symptoms more pronounced than those surrounding the subject of the economy. While Marxist economics has witnessed of late a flurry of recent works, many quite profound in depth and exhaustive in complexity, recent activism around austerity, joblessness, and non-transparency, while quite creative in some respects, seems hesitant to oppose the status quo mantra, there is no alternative, with anything other than nostalgia for the past. In other words, the status quo ante. At a time when the United States has entered into its most prolonged slump since the Great Depression, the European project meanwhile founders on the shoals of debt and nationalism. Even if the once triumphant neoliberal ideology of free markets for free people seems utterly discredited, the strange non-death of neoliberalism, as a recent book title has dubbed it, seems poised to carry on indefinitely. The need for a Marxist politics adequate to the crisis is as great as such a politics is lacking. And 2011 seems to be fading into the past. In Greece today, as elsewhere in Europe, existing left parties have for the most part acted as passive observers in the face of the crisis, eschewing radical solutions, if they even imagine such solutions to exist. In the United States, Occupy has vanished from the parks and streets, leaving only bitter grumbling where there once seemed to be creativity and open-ended potential. Strike Debt promises to carry on the fight that Occupy initiated, but it has only elicited mixed responses so far, from jubilation, in the sense of a rolling debt jubilee, in some circles, to its outright dismissal in others as a charity telethon. While joblessness haunts billions worldwide, politicization of the issue still seems chiefly the prerogative of the right. Meanwhile, the poor worldwide face relentless price rises in fuel and essential foodstuffs. The prospects for world revolution seem remote at best, and even bankers and hedge fund managers lament democracy's failure to confront the crisis. In this sense, it seems plausible to argue that there is no crisis at all, but simply the latest stage in an ongoing social regression. The concept of crisis itself appears to lose all meaning under conditions of normalized catastrophe, in which there's no real prospect of anything particularly that is likely to change, or if so, at least not for the better. So the questions we posed, which we asked the panelists to respond to, are first, do we live in a crisis of capitalism today? And if so, of what sort? Political, economic, social? Is the capitalism of the present basically the same in its laws of motion, and can be grasped equally as well as it was by Marx? What difference, if any, does the collapse of the socialist workers' movement make for our understanding of capitalism? The second question was that many on the left welcomed the Occupy movement in 2011 because, above all, it responded to capitalist austerity in its slogans and characterized itself in class terms. Did Occupy betoken a renewed salience of class? How did Occupy and other movements worldwide differ from their political response, whether by new social movements or other political expressions, to the crisis of Fordism beginning in the late 1960s and crystallizing with the oil crisis in 1973. Third, how does the present crisis compare with past crises of capital? What might we expect to be the duration of the present crisis? Is there an end in sight? Or are we witnessing the terminal crisis of capitalism, as some have put it? How do we know? If not the end of capitalism as such, does the present crisis at least signal an end to neoliberalism? If so, what will take its place? Fourth question. At different moments of its unfolding, the crisis has been differently expressed in different locations. A subprime mortgage crisis in North America, followed by a sovereign debt crisis in Europe, and now is still different form in China. What is the extent of the present crisis, and how has it been distributed globally? Unevenly? What does globalization look like in a period of prolonged crisis? Is the era of US hegemony at an end? If so, what will take its place? How is or was American imperialism connected to first Fordism and then later post-Fordist capitalism? And how does the new capitalism challenge a new American empire-led reorganization? The fifth and final question is, why are sophisticated leftist understandings of the world seemingly unable to assist in the task of changing it? Conversely, is the world even intelligible despite our incapacity to transform it politically? Can the left survive as an economics or social theory alone? Is our work more difficult today in theorizing capitalism, or of a completely different kind than it was for past generations of leftist intellectuals? And finally, perhaps the most central question, what does it mean to interpret the world without being able to change it? Starting in alphabetical order, I'll turn it over to Professor Loren Goldner.
Good evening. I'm sort of tentatively calling my presentation tonight Fictitious Capital and Contracted Social Reproduction. I gave a similar talk in London a few days ago, and it took 45 minutes. This is based on a 12,000-word essay, which I thought I might read to you, but I don't think I'm going to have time in the 12 minutes that are allotted. So, I'd also like to say that in terms of practice, it's very nice that on November 14th we have general strikes breaking out throughout the southern flank of Europe. As far as I know, most such general strikes have been parades organized by the official unions and political parties, but this may lead to something else. And let's not also forget the ongoing miners' strikes in South Africa, and since there are 120,000 incidents a year in China, that works out to, I don't know, at least 50 strikes a day. So we can keep in mind that as we're sitting here talking about the crisis, there are people in motion trying to do something about it. So I'd like to start out my talk with one of my favorite quotes from Marx's Grundrisse. This is from either page 706 or 707 of the Penguin edition. Capital is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum, while it posits labor time on the other side as the sole measure and source of wealth. I would say that unpacking that one sentence can get us very far in understanding the crisis and also the history of the last more than 100 years. Okay, I put some graphs up here on the board. As big as the board is, I'm sure that people in the back of the room can't read my handwriting. Probably even some people very close can't read my handwriting. So I'm going to go over it. And what I have here are three different ways of talking about the total reproduction of society, or the total product. But the first column I call use value in social reproduction. And that column could refer to any society. It could refer to the most simple pre-capitalist society, to feudalism, capitalism, and presumably also to socialism, communism, if we ever get there. And this breaks down, as you know from Marx, into means of production, the reproduction of labor power, and surplus. Now what happens to that surplus? The Kwakiutl in British Columbia expend that surplus in huge aristocratic construction of wealth to show how powerful they are. Capitalists, of course, save and accumulate it and invest it, or increasingly don't invest it. And then in the middle, of course, is the reproduction of labor power. Any society, using means of production like bows and arrows, has to have some people who can go out and use them. So anyway, that's a kind of use value approximation that could be used to talk about any society. Now we move over to capital. And in a very simple form, I've broken it down into the classic Marxist categories of surplus value, S, variable capital V, and constant capital C. And within constant capital, there's a breakdown into fixed capital, referring generally to machinery and other tools that are used. Circulating capital is more things like raw materials. And where I want to go with this, I'm trying to start out with A, B, C, and I want to wind up with X, Y, and Z. The real theme, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the idea of fictitious capital. Now, what is fictitious capital? I define it as claims on social wealth, on the social surplus, which have no correspondence in any existing social surplus. And in capitalism, of course, that means surplus value. And I put down here in the lower box on column 2, origins of fictitious capital, in that it's the advancing productivity of labor in capitalism, which is an anarchic system, which is constantly devaluing the constant capital that invested by the capitalist class. I'll unpack that in a moment when I get to the third column. But it's very important to see that sort of in a pure form. And the pure form is also important because, as you know, if you've read the on capital, the capital volumes 1 and 2 is essentially a description of a pure capitalist system in which really, basically, there are only two social classes. The wage labor proletariat and the capitalist class bourgeoisie. Other classes enter the picture, such as peasants in this long historical chapter on accumulation. But Marx is trying to set up a pure model and then, in volume 3, move to the more everyday appearances of the system. But nonetheless, I just wanted to get that devalorization of constant capital into the picture when we're just talking in pure value terms. Now, value, as you know in Marx, is defined as socially necessary labor time of reproduction. And I want to emphasize that because a lot of people read Volume 1, and particularly the opening chapters, where Marx is talking a lot about the embodied value of a commodity as socially necessary labor time embodied in it. But later, when he moves to social reproduction, he's talking about an expanding system in which these early definitions are superseded. Okay, now let me turn to the last column, which is by far the most complex and interesting. And this is how capital appears to capitalists. Now, capitalists don't know anything about columns 1 or 2. They have a vague idea of use value in the sense that as they're running a society into the ground, say, for example, in the contemporary debate over infrastructure, reinforced by recent events here in New York, capitalists sort of come to a realization that use value does play a certain kind of role. But by and large, individual capitalists are interested in profit, and use value is a pure byproduct. Okay, now let's look at what happens to that surplus for the capitalist class. Capital appears to capitalists as titles to wealth. That means different kinds of paper, ultimately, that are claims on that surplus. In profit, we have stocks, with interest, we have bonds, and a million things that have proliferated in the last 30 or 40 years in the great expansion of the financial sector. And finally, we have ground rent. These are 3 different parts of the capitalist class. And actually, Marx calls the people who live from ground rent almost like an independent third class capital. Now, one thing that's very interesting and important to emphasize about recent capitalist history is the way in which income from interest and ground rent, and I mean above all urban ground rent, the tremendous income that a part of the capitalist class gets from the sale and rental of buildings of all kinds, has long overcome the total amount of profit directly derived from industry. And I think this is a very important thing to understand the contemporary situation. Now, over on the right part of the surplus, I put a category that doesn't really get as much attention as it should, which I call capitalist consumption. Capitalist consumption is most discussed in Marx in Volume 2 of Capital. And I want to sidestep or not get into the question of productive and unproductive labor, but I just want to talk about that part of the population, which in this society, in countries like the United Kingdom, is really quite large. I would estimate it at minimum as 50 to 60% of the so-called active population. Capitalist consumption, of course, is not just the consumption of capitalists themselves, not the yachts and the lifestyle out of the Hamptons or in Malibu and places like that. It's the consumption of all the hangers-on of the capitalist class. Marx has this colorful formulation, I can't remember in which volume, in which he refers to king, minister, professor, and whore as different embodiments of the hangers-on of the capitalist class. But I'm expanding this out quite a bit to include state bureaucrats. Let's not forget that 35 to 40% of the U.S. GDP goes to state expenditure at the federal, state, and local level. Corporate bureaucrats and managers. In 1950, there were 10 workers for every manager in industry. Today, there are 3. The military, police, prison system, all of these elements that enforce capitalist social relationships. And finally, probably the biggest single group of all, the so-called FIRE sector, or finance, insurance, real estate, that, again, is another expression of the way in which interest and ground rent are siphoning off very large parts of surplus value. Now, down in the second part of this column, we have the total wage bill. That's not just the pay packets or paychecks of working population. It's also everything that goes into education and training. In the United States in the last 30 or 40 years, the military has increasingly assumed this role with the collapse of a lot of schools. And so one has to think of it, of the total wage bill in larger sense than just merely the wage. And finally, down at the bottom, there are fixed and circulating divisions of capital. Again, getting back to this question of devalorize fixed capital through productivity of labor. So I want to, now, this picture is not complete without talking about certain countervailing tendencies. And the main ones that I emphasize are the following. The non-reproduction of labor power. These are different ways in which capital in crisis transfers B and C to S as a way of saving itself. And in the United States and most countries in crisis over the last 40 years, we see the non-reproduction of labor power. Just think of 40% of all high school students never finishing high school in New York City and other parts of the country as one example of that. And equally, possibly more important, primitive accumulation. Now, what is primitive accumulation? Marx defines it as the separation of petty producers from the means of production. Now, there's a lot of debate about this. Didn't Marx just mean one time in the 17th and 18th century, the expropriation of the English peasantry? But I think it's a permanent feature of the capitalist system. In this way, I follow aspects of Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote a very interesting book about the accumulation of capital, with some very powerful chapters at the end about examples of this in the 19th century. And I don't think one has to go along with all of Rosa Luxemburg's reasoning to recognize that this kind of recruitment of labor power out of subsectors of the world economy, and most importantly, the peasantry. Just think of India, think of China, large parts of Latin America, Africa, all kinds of people who are not wage workers, who are recruited to the wage labor system
1 minute.
After another sub-sector has paid their reproduction costs. So just to conclude, I would say that what keeps this proliferation of fictitious capital afloat in all the forms described is a general process of non-reproduction, both of labor power and of aspects of constant capital, such as infrastructure. The U.S., the American Organization of Civic Engineers estimates $2.3 trillion of infrastructure innovation is necessary now just to bring things back to where they, to standard level. And of course, after Sandy, I'm sure that amount has increased significantly. So hopefully we can get more into this in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Loren Goldner. Next, proceeding alphabetically, Professor David Harvey.
It's hard to do something in 10 minutes. The questions took 20, but so I had a very interesting experience this year that in May I was in Istanbul for about 2-3 weeks, giving some lectures and hanging out with social movement people in the city. Istanbul is a boom town. It's absolutely incredible what's going on there. Turkey's growing at around 7% a year, close to China. The city is full of cranes. Somebody asked me what I thought of it. I said, well, it reminded me of Spain in 2005. They're talking about a new bridge across the Bosphorus at the northern end. They think the population of Istanbul will be 40 million in about 10, 15 years. It's now 18 million when it's about 10 million. I mean, this is a real boom town. It's incredible what's going on. The place is just full of massive. I then flew 2.5 hours to Athens. I don't have to tell you about Athens, I'm sure you all know, so I'm not going to go into any graphic description. But you move from a boom town with all of this going on to a catastrophe. And it's a 2-hour flight. And the big question I think we have to face is, how do we create a theoretical apparatus that can understand those differentials? Because as I go around the world, I spend a lot of time in Argentina. Argentina was a disaster in 2001, 2002, 2003. By 2004, it had reneged on its debt and it was booming. It's been booming ever since, though it's now getting into kind of problems. China, for example, 2009, it had lost something like 30 million jobs because of the collapse of the export industries. The IMF ILO recorded at the end of the year a net job loss in China of 3 million, which means that the Chinese have created 27 million jobs in 9 months. How the hell did they do that? What did they do? Well, it was partly a revival of the export industry. The crash was so bad, so it wasn't bad. But the other thing was it was a huge expansion. An urbanization project and an infrastructure project. In China, if you're told by the Central Committee to lend and you're a banker, you don't sit there and say you'll think about it, you do it. And so this huge labor absorption practice in China did this. By the end of 2009, this country was still at a net job loss of over 7 million. We couldn't get any of it back. Why not? Well, it has nothing to do with the politics. You had a stupid austerity here. You had, in effect, a kind of a Keynesian expansion program in China. And anybody who was connected to the China trade, of course, did very well. Australia didn't experience anything going on in this because it was sending all of these raw materials to China. Chile did very well. One of the reasons Argentina did very well was it was selling all of its agricultural commodities to China. I mean, Argentina is one big soybean plantation now for the China trade. So we have to have a theoretical framework, if you like, that can encompass these incredible differences that are going on and an incredible dynamic. And I tried to do that a little bit in of capital by thinking about the way in which flows of capital as they move hit barriers, and then, as Marx puts it, every limit and barrier has to be overcome, and the barrier itself can be a form of crisis, but you then surpass it, and you get a crisis somewhere else. But you can do this geographically. Geographically, the crisis has moved around. It starts in Southern California, and well, southwestern United States, and the property markets there, Florida, Georgia, to some degree. It ends up sort of hitting the consumer industries, and so you start to get unemployment. The impact on China is huge, as I've already mentioned, the loss of export markets. It then sort of spins over into the financial sector, and then the financial sector has to be cleaned up, and to the degree it's cleaned up, you create a sovereign debt problem, as Spain is a classic example of this. So it's moving around from sector to sector. It's also moving around geographically. One minute we're looking at a newspaper and it's Iceland that's a problem. Next day it's Dubai that's a problem, and then all of a sudden it's Greece that's a problem. And if you don't have a theoretical framework that can understand the rapidity of these moves, then it seems to me you're not going to be able to really encompass what's going on and how it's going on. So the framework that I initially set up was to look at the flows, and to look at the barriers to the flows, and to look at which barriers were the significant ones at a particular historical moment in time, and how those barriers get circumvented, and then the crisis moves somewhere else. And the argument I would make is that the crisis tendencies of capitalism are never resolved, they're always just simply moved around from one space to another, or from one sector to another. So, like I mentioned, it moves from the housing market to the financial system to sovereign debt. Threat to sovereign debt to move back into the banking system. I mean, there's all that kind of movement going on. And so what we have to do, it seems to me, is to set up this sort of framework of the flow of capital and the continuity of the flow of capital. Whenever that continuity gets blocked, then you get a crisis. So this is, if you like, one of the ways in which I would think it would be useful to look at the crisis. Now, the fact that it's moving around this way, of course, poses great difficulty for organizing. I mean, the difficulty is, you know, there's this big eruption of an anti-capitalist movement in Argentina in 2002, 2003. And, you know, there are the assemblies and there are the takeovers of the factories, and it looks like this is a real revolutionary situation. You know, 5 years later, Argentina's booming and everybody's gone back to work in the conventional places, apart from the fact, yeah, there are still some occupied factories, and some people like the idea of having assemblies and so on, but basically the country's back, you know, into its normal way of operating, which is, you know, just one political disaster after another, but you know, Argentinians are used to that. So this is what we've got to do is to come up with a framework which helps understand the movement at the same time as it helps us understand why it is that something that looks like it's going to burst out into a revolutionary movement here suddenly can rescind back. And the result is that class struggle is very volatile right now. I mean, if you were in Bolivia in 2003, 2005, you'd be looking at El Alto, which was in revolutionary mode, and then Evo Morales comes to power, and now you've got a kind of strange kind of mix of indigenous thinking and neoliberal kind of compromises and all the rest of it. So this seems to me to be one of the most important things to do. Now the other thing I've been doing, however, is to kind of shift a little bit and say something else, which is I'd like to take seriously Marx's argument that crises are all manifestations or representations or emanations, if you like, of the internal contradictions of capital. It occurred to me the other day that I have the habit, and I've noticed this habit is actually quite widespread, that if you come across something you don't understand, you say, oh, well, that's the internal contradictions of capitalism. and I actually thought to myself, what do we really know about the structure of internal contradictions within a capital, within the capitalist mode of production? Now, I'm not talking about capitalism in general, because there are all sorts of contradictions and so on, but just theoretically, how would you do it? So I went back through capital, and I went back through the Grundrisse and all this kind of thing, and thought, well, how many contradictions can I see, and what's the relationship between one contradiction and another contradiction, and how do these contradictions actually affect each other and build into massive crises? Because the contradictions are breaking out all of the time. But when does a contradiction, as Marx said, become an absolute contradiction and generate a crisis? That seems to me kind of an interesting way to start to think of it. And I sort of counted up, and what I've got to so far is I've got 17 internal contradictions to be happening. Now, I've already used up most of my time, so this will give me half a second to talk about every single one of them. So I'm not going to do that. But I'll just give you a simple example of how this sort of thing works. The basic contradiction is obviously that between use value and exchange value. One place to look at this is about housing. Housing has a use value, and I'm not going to go into what that might be, you can imagine that. And initially, of course, people were out on the frontier, just chop down some trees and build themselves a house, you know. But then eventually, housing became a commodity, so to be produced as a commodity. And you look at the Georgian terraces in Britain and all this, and in the end you look also at back-to-back housing in industrial cities. It's produced as a commodity and it's sold as a commodity. And eventually, however, the people who dwell in it don't rent, they start to be incorporated into home ownership. And this became very popular towards the end of the 19th century because this was seen as a way of stabilizing society, that the dwellers there would eventually become owners. And this became, so the use values then of the house is then contrasted with the fact that the people dwelling in it not only use it for a use value, but they also use it as a form of saving. This became critically important in the Great Depression, and all the financial reforms of the Great Depression was about encouraging home ownership amongst the working classes. And as was once famously said, things like the savings and loan societies and the building societies in Britain were seen as one of the best defenses against Bolshevism. Or put another way around, debt-encumbered homeowners don't go on strike. And so the incorporation of the US working class as homeowners, the affluent members as homeowners in suburban locations, turned them into very conservative people. And they became defenders of property rights, and they became defenders of capitalism rather than potential enemies. And that was something that's consciously thought about in the 1930s. So this saving then became very, very important as part of what housing was about. But around 1980, people started to find something else, which was housing was no longer simply about a form of saving, it was also a form of speculation. And at that time, it's very interesting, you go back and you look at all of the what to do journals, and what the do journals say, if you want to improve the exchange value of your house, these are the kinds of improvements you put in. You don't put glass mirrors on your bedroom ceilings, because nobody kind of really sort of think that's going to improve the value of the house. You put in a new kitchen or something like that. So you have this whole kind of instruction on how to improve the exchange value of the house. And so you do that, and you start to speculate, and you buy a house for $200,000, and then 5 years later you put in some improvements, and you can sell it for $300,000. So suddenly the house becomes, the exchange value starts to take over. Now what I'm talking about here is the way in which housing suddenly becomes a center of exchange value manipulation and speculation and all the rest of it. And we've seen various times in the savings and loan crisis of, end of the 1980s, and then we have finally the crash in 2008, the whole thing blows up, in which exchange value at that point actually ends up with a whole bunch of people being foreclosed so that they cannot have the use value anymore. So this conflict between use value and exchange value has evolved historically, and it has actually centered some of the crisis that we have been in. Now, just one final point, which is this. The nice thing about talking about the contradictions is this, that it actually tells you what an anti-capitalist politics should be about. And the anti-capitalist politics in this case would be to say, we do not want housing actually vulnerable to the exchange value calculus. We want it to be set out as a use value which everybody should have access to. And the same would be true of education, the same would be true of healthcare, of water supply, of all those kinds of things. In other words, what you do at the end of this, you say, well, that contradiction has led us into this crisis, but we have a particular kind of political stance now, which is to roll back what neoliberalism was very much about, which was actually privatizing all of those things, making more and more sure that they became vehicles for exchange value accumulation, and went in that way. Now this is the way in which that contradiction contributed to the crisis and actually gives us a way of thinking. Now, the second contradiction is a great one, and I'm not going to get into it because he's telling me to shut up, so I'll just leave it
There will be time in the panelists' ensuing remarks that we can take up maybe some of these other issues. But for now, Dr. Anderson.
Thank you. I'm going to remain seated because I have a bit of a fever. I want to start by tackling one of the questions we were asked to consider, which is this, quote, do different interpretations of the crisis really recommend different political strategies? I think it's very sad and even tragic that this question has to be asked. It's a sign of the irrationalism and elitism in which much of the left is mired. Now, the answer to the question depends on your political orientation. If you think the masses need you to lead them step by step toward a more advanced consciousness, like pieces on a game board, how they understand the crisis is not important. You'll supply the understanding. But how you understand it is not important at this point either, because you can't lead people around until you have their allegiance. So that becomes the all-important task, winning allegiance of people, appealing to them on the basis of where they're at now. So you don't engage in rational argument and discussion, but you try to inspire people, provide soundbite solutions to social and economic problems, and you demonize the other. Wall Street, neoliberalism, the 1%. But equally, if you think people can change society through spontaneous activity alone, or spontaneous activity plus a vision that they arrive at by consensus, then activity is all important. Understanding how capitalism functions and malfunctions and what must be changed in order to transcend it, they're not important. We'll supposedly transcend it just by deciding to do things differently and then implementing whatever we decide, as if there were no such thing as unintended consequences. So rational argument and discussion are not important. Indeed, they're counterproductive from this vantage point because they lead to disagreement, disunity, and inaction. So the watchword is keep your opinions to yourself. Let's unite on the basis of actions and lowest common denominator, beliefs and aspirations. I begin from a very different starting point. First, most people lack information and access to ideas, but don't suffer from false consciousness that makes them resist the information and ideas. Secondly, they want a real solution to the ongoing economic malaise. Third, they're not going to rise up unthinkingly to change things without knowing what they're trying to accomplish and without knowing which actions and changes have a reasonable chance of accomplishing it. And fourth, actions do indeed have unintended consequences. This is a huge problem, as the many failed revolutions and failed utopian experiments attest. The road to the present morass has been paved with good intentions. This suggests the need for severely rationalist politics. We have to be oppressively aware that some supposed solutions to our economic problems seem good on the surface but won't work, or they'll make the crisis worse, or they're just going to result in different institutions and different people running a capitalist system that's governed by the same old economic laws and that's subject to the same crisis tendencies. People want a real solution, and that's what we need. And to arrive at that kind of a solution, we need a lot of rational argument and discussion, and a much better grasp of the facts in order to obtain a deep and rigorous understanding of the causes of the economic crisis, or whatever you want to call it. My book, which is available for sale back there, by the way, The Failure of Capitalist Production, it's a contribution to the kind of discussion that I think is needed. I want to talk a bit about the facts I learned when writing it and argue that these facts do have important political implications. Now, I didn't set out to write a book. I accidentally discovered some stuff that I found rather surprising because it contradicted the conventional account on the left of the underlying causes of the Great Recession. So I began to dig deeper. The more I dug, the more I discovered that contradicted the conventional left account. Eventually became a book, and one with a very different interpretation of the underlying causes of the recession. So here's a thumbnail sketch of what I discovered. First, the turning point of recent U.S. economic history was not the rise of neoliberalism. The major changes in long-term economic trends started in the 1970s or earlier, before the rise of neoliberalism. Slowdown in economic growth, relative increase in borrowing, global financial instability, decline in growth of U.S. public infrastructure investment, and so forth. This alone cast doubt on the political determinism of the conventional left account and the common view that a reversal of neoliberalism is key to solving our economic problems. Second, contrary to what the conventional left account suggests, I found that U.S. corporations' rate of return on their investment, or rate of profit, did not rebound under neoliberalism. It fell from the mid-1950s through the early 1980s and then never recovered in a sustained way. Indeed, if we employ an inclusive definition of profit, the rate of profit continued to trend downward sharply after the early 1980s. And importantly, U.S. multinational corporations' rate of profit on their foreign investment also trended downward. Third, this has to do with the long-term slowdown in the growth of productive investment, or what's called the rate of capital accumulation. The conventional left account says that the slowdown was caused by financialization. Corporations diverted profits from production to financial uses. But I found that there was no such diversion. Almost all of the fall in the rate of accumulation took place by 2001, and between 1981, when Reagan came into office, and 2001, the period under neoliberalism, U.S. corporations invested a bigger share of their profit in production than they did between 1947 and 1980 before neoliberalism. In other words, productive investment absorbed a bigger share of their surplus than it had before. So the slowdown in the growth of productive investment, and it's real, but it wasn't caused by difficulties in absorbing the surplus. It was caused by a relative lack of surplus or profit in the first place. Basically, the entire fall in U.S. corporations' rate of accumulation or productive investment between 1948 and 2007 is attributable to the fall in their after-tax rate of profit. Okay. Fourth, and what was most surprising to me, I found that even though there's been an increase in income inequality in this country, that's real, but profits did not increase at the expense of wages and benefits. The share of corporate output that employees receive, their share, did not change. The share of the net national product that the working class was able to buy also did not change. Okay? That means that their incomes enabled them to buy just as big a share of the product as before, without going deeper into debt. So a redistribution from wages and benefits to profit didn't occur, so it didn't serve to depress demand, even if we ignore the theoretical problems with that idea, and it did not lead to a buildup of debt. There was a buildup for other reasons. Okay, so it seems to me that the underlying causes of the Great Recession, at least in the US, are a long-term fall in the rate of profit, which led to a long-term slowdown in productive investment, which in turn led to slower growth of output and income. And the slowdown in income growth led to ever-rising debt burdens as the government policies that have been repeatedly kicked the can down the road by throwing even more debt at the problem and encouraging private borrowers to do the same. So we've had a series of burst bubbles and debt crises, and ultimately the Great Recession. Now, of course, the recession was triggered by a financial crisis. There's no denying that. But if the financial issue was the whole problem, the economy should have rebounded smartly long ago, since the financial crisis in the US was quelled by the end of 2008. But there's been no smart rebound anywhere in the world. And I think that's mainly because of the profitability and debt problems that remain unresolved, and the political consequences of the debt problems, especially for the future of the Eurozone. Okay, so 2 minutes. Okay, what are the political implications of these facts and this analysis? Okay, first, neoliberalism didn't cause the change trends in the economy, and financialization didn't cause profit to be diverted from production. So people want a broad multi-class alliance against neoliberalism, replacing the bad capitalist with the good capitalist that want profit to be invested in production and jobs to be created. This isn't going to solve the problems. Productive investment's not going to rebound as long as profitability and debt problems and the associated lack of confidence remain unresolved. I'm going to skip a little bit. Okay. Debt forgiveness can help people in debt in debtor countries, but it's not going to solve the economic malaise. To reverse the malaise, the debt problem has to be solved in a way that boosts lenders' confidence that they're going to be repaid, not the opposite. If lenders are forced to forgive some debts that they can collect, they're going to learn their lesson and not lend or lend at much higher interest rates, and we're going to not have any solution to the crisis. Okay? There has not been a redistribution in the United States from wages and benefits to profits. So reduced inequality is certainly going to help those at the bottom, reducing inequality, but it's not going to solve the economic crisis, which is not caused by this. Profit is the fuel in which capitalism runs. The problem that capitalism is facing is that it's been low on fuel for quite some time. And any redistributionist measures that siphon off even more fuel are not going to help stabilize capitalism. They're going to do the opposite. Okay, so in short, I don't think there's any progressive or left solution within the confines of capitalism to the ongoing economic malaise. Within the system, the problems are going to be solved, if they do get solved, by solving the profitability and debt problems. So I'd like to suggest that we stop thinking about solving the crisis and instead assist people's ongoing struggles to protect their incomes and jobs and homes. Concessions were won during the Great Depression. They can be won again. They're not going to solve capitalism's problems. They're going to make them worse. But the concessions are worth fighting for and supporting. And I think we need to offer the prospect of a socialist way out of the crisis. I think it's a real historical possibility right now. Struggles have been accelerating throughout the world. The problem is the left response, or the lack of response. In the fall of 2008, if you remember, the notion that capitalism failed was commonplace in the mainstream media. But it went nowhere because almost all of the left went in the opposite direction. The left tried to downplay the severity of the crisis. So it didn't even echo the conclusion that capitalism has failed. And I think that was an enormous lost opportunity and explains a lot of the problems that this panel is meant to address.
Thank you. Finally, Dr. Mattick.
Can I use this also? Turn it on?
Hello?
Good. I learned from Rothwald's introduction that the 4 questions I was asked to respond to had metastasized into 6. But in any case, 10 or 12 minutes is quite a short time in which to attempt to say anything serious. I will therefore concentrate on the first and third and last of these questions. And for the same reason, I will read rather than extemporizing to make sure that I actually say something in 10 minutes. I'm going to start with the last question. What does it mean to interpret the world without being able to change it? This is not particularly mysterious. Changing the world requires the collective action of very large numbers of people. Valuable chunks of understanding can be achieved by small numbers or even individuals. This does not, as the conference organizers suggested in their questions it might, mean that capitalism is a system devoid of human agency. Human agency keeps capitalism going as people go to work, go to school, buy and sell goods. The process of social reproduction is carried out by active, conscious individuals. The existence at various times of social movements working against that reproduction attests to other directions human agency can move. The miseries the social reproduction process generates explains those movements, and with them the various efforts to understand the system that constitute the history of socialist thought. As Marx observed long ago, it is social being that, practically speaking, determines consciousness, not the other way around. The most profound understandings of capitalism will have no practical importance unless what used to be called the broad masses of the people are engaged in social transformation in ways that lead them to find those understandings useful. Marx's own thought provides an excellent example. His brilliant analysis of capitalism was for the most part not even read, much less understood or acted on in the heyday of Marxist movements. It was, after all, of little relevance to the social democratic projects of the regulation of the market system in Western Europe and the construction of state capitalism in Russia. Today, with the disappearance of the historical left, Marxian ideas have become largely an academic specialty. On the other hand, what seems an increasing interest in those ideas, inside and outside the academy, attests to a growing discomfort with the existing social system, especially since the start of the current depression in 2007. It is not impossible that some of those at present engaged in interpreting the world may someday get a chance to participate in changing it. It may be hard on a thinker to discover how little brilliant interpretation shapes history, but there is a positive side to this situation. If the proletarian revolution required a firm grasp of Marxist capital, with, for example, a correct understanding of value-price transformation by the aforesaid broad masses, it's hard to imagine how that revolution could ever get going. But luckily, this is not how social movements happen. They happen when large enough numbers of people find the existing state of affairs unbearable, to such a degree that they are willing to risk the comforts of ordinary life, not to mention life itself, to try something new. Then they look around for ideas that might help them understand what is happening to them and what they can do about it. Social theory can help explain how such situations may come about. It cannot be expected to produce them. The organizers' first question asked whether we live in a crisis today. And the third asked for a deeper analysis of its character. Crisis is a term used very loosely. I like to remember its original meaning of turning point. A crisis, coming after a period of prosperity, initiates a period of depression. Thus, it corresponds to what on the other end is called a recovery. In this sense, the crisis of 2007-8 is over, but the depression lingers on, despite all the official talk of recovery. And even this talk always qualifies the latter as jobless, or sputtering, or fragile. Of course, the downturn, like all developments in capitalist history, is uneven in its effects. The weakest are hit hardest. Small business is being crushed in Greece, while Germany is still doing fairly well. As Detroit is depopulated, housing prices rise in Brooklyn and Paris. For this reason, the social effects are likewise uneven, though this also reflects the strengths and weaknesses of local traditions. Quebec students defeated an effort to increase university tuition, while American students have been unable to prevent similar developments. Such movements, like the mass demonstrations in Lisbon and in Spain that have so far held back somewhat the assault on the Iberian working class, have so far remained sporadic, localized, and limited in their challenge to the capitalist economic order. For this reason, we cannot speak of a social or political crisis at the present time. This economic crisis and the downturn it led into are like earlier episodes of the same type in the history of capitalism since the early 19th century. But like each of those predecessors, they have novel features. Crises manifest deep-rooted problems of profitability in the capitalist economy, which discourage investment and so create unemployment and market floods. They are overcome as the depression acts to shift capital values and labor costs downwards. The devaluation of capital makes possible higher profit rates and so a revival of economic affairs. The last major downturn of this type, which began in the 1930s and led into World War II, was so destructive in its effects on capital values as to make possible the 20 years of prosperity known to economists as the Golden Age. But even this prosperous period required constant infusions of government spending to maintain low levels of unemployment. When the Golden Age came to an end in the mid-1970s, government borrowing and spending was further increased. More and more government policies also facilitated the expansion of credit that underlay the debt-based version of prosperity that lasted despite continual debt crises, stock market crashes, currency exchange crises, and decades of depression in Japan into the 21st century. The failure of all this to restore the profitability of capital could be seen in the flow of money from capital investment to speculation, offering high short-term profits, at least to the well-placed or lucky. And just as capital flowed into speculation, instead of less productive, into productive investment, producing the effect of temporary prosperity by means of a series of bubbles. Working class living standards were maintained by the massive growth of consumer debt, culminating in workers' participation in the mortgage bubble in the early 21st century. Like the growth of state debt and the welfare state, the difficulty we see today in doing away with them registers the decline of the private enterprise economy. Despite its dynamism and the gigantic increases in the productivity of human labor that it has achieved since the early 19th century, and despite the disappearance of political and social barriers to its spread in the course of the 20th, capitalism has not been able to generate the quantities of profit required to incorporate much of the world's population into its modern industrial form. The failure of the non-financial parts of the economy to expand sufficiently showed itself in 2008 in the near collapse of the whole Rube Goldberg device of cantilevered finance. For the same reason, the massive increase in government spending that avoided a return to depression conditions after the mid-1960s led not to a steady flow of profits from a now primed pump, but today's increasingly problematic state deficits. From the viewpoint of Marx's theory of capital accumulation, it has been precisely the avoidance of depression conditions that has prevented a new transition to prosperity since the end of the post-war Golden Age. The desire to avoid a full-bore depression still, as of late 2012, still dominates among the global ruling class. Although smaller scale business, Spanish and Irish builders and developers, Portuguese agriculturists, Greek manufacturers and shopkeepers, although all these people have been pushed into bankruptcy, the European Central Bank, along with the International Monetary Fund and the Federal Reserve Bank of the US, is printing money to keep the banks and hedge funds whose investments powered the recent expansion of the euro and dollar zones afloat. At the same time, an evident will to extract as much as possible from the world's working class by cutting wages, including socially administered segments of the wage, such as pensions and health insurance, along with the elimination or privatization of government services, with attendant cuts in public employment. It's held somewhat in check by mass expressions of anger, so that austerity has not progressed as rapidly, for example, in Spain or Italy, as in smaller and weaker economies like Ireland or Greece. Is this to say that the current crisis cycle has moved capitalism to the point of breakdown in the sense of self-destruction? No, because today, as at all earlier moments, capitalism's fate depends on the human agency mentioned earlier, the willingness of human beings to engage in the difficult struggles needed to overthrow existing relations of social power and create new forms of production and consumption. On the other hand, in its current condition, capitalism promises economic difficulties for decades to come, with increased assaults on the earnings and working conditions of those who are still lucky enough to be wage earners around the world. Waves of bankruptcies and business consolidation for capitalist firms, and increasingly serious conflicts among economic entities and even nations over just who is going to pay for the system's survival. The mass unemployment and material deprivation that Marx predicted as the long-term outcome of capitalist development have become features of the world economy. That, if not permanent, will clearly be with us for an extended time, especially in combination with the havoc promised by the ongoing ecological catastrophe. It is not inconceivable that this could lead to social and political convulsions that would deserve the name of crisis. Thank you.
In the same order, the panelists will now be allowed 2 to 3 minutes to respond to each other's remarks. So starting with Loren Goldner.
Okay, so I have some questions that I would like to pose to the other panelists. In the case of David Harvey, I'd like to, I realize there's not time, but I'd like to hear about the 16 of the 17 conventions that we didn't get into. But I would like to focus on what he said about the housing bubble that began in the 1980s and continued right up to 2007, 2008. It seems to me that the housing bubble, and maybe you agree, was really a secondary aspect, a response to a deeper crisis that you might call a crisis of profitability in the system as a whole. And that it was just merely the final phase of a kind of attempt to solve the crisis by putting consumption power in the hands of people with supposedly appreciating assets, i.e. their homes. So I'd like to hear a comment on that. As for Andrew's presentation, Dr. Kliman, I really like your dating of the crisis back to the 1970s. I completely agree with that, although we might disagree about this or that aspect of it. But you say in your presentation, and you say in the book that you were mentioning during your presentation, that there's been no fall in real wages for American workers. And I'm not going to argue with the statistics, but I merely want to point out one thing which I didn't get around to mentioning in my own charts, namely the disappearance or since the 1960s, of the one-paycheck family. And the fact that with these same levels of income, the possibility of one paycheck reproducing a family of four has become as extinct as the dinosaurs. That Marx mentions in Capital in several places. It's not sufficiently emphasized by most people that the wage of a worker is not just to reproduce the worker, but it's to reproduce the next generation of workers. And I would say that the rise of the 2- and 3-paycheck family is a sure sign of a kind of contraction of social reproduction. Finally, with Paul Mattick, I really agree with virtually everything you said, but I'd like to hear you elaborate more about the devalorization represented by the crisis of 1929-1945, or in my view, really since from 1914 to 1945, one long phase of destruction that did lay the foundation for the post-war boom, and why you think that something comparable is not going to happen now. I think that what we've had since the 1970s has been kind of a slow motion crash landing, or a kind of substitute World War III, in which there's, on a world scale, has been tremendous destruction. We just have to think about Africa, which has 13. Okay, can I just finish my question? And finally, why do you think that social revolution is not a possible outcome of this crisis, or do you think that?
So, Dr. Harvey?
Yeah. I was a little confused by your understanding of fictitious capital. I understood it as a capitalization of any income stream, which they could then be bought and sold in the market, so stocks and shares and all those kinds of things are capitalization of an income stream. But what struck me about Marx's analysis of it is this is the only time in Capital where Marx comes back to the question of fetishism. And the implication of fetishism and why it is that the fetishistic character of the credit system can produce the circulation of fictitious capitals, and what that's all about leads into an interesting kind of question as to why it is that capital actually tolerates craziness, as Marx talks about, the insanity of the credit system. And so I would like, in some ways, to invite you to explain a little bit why credit is so significant within a capitalist mode of production, when by opening the credit Pandora's box, all kinds of nasty things jump out, including the speculative waves that we've been experiencing. Two comments on Andrew's thing. In Brief History of Neoliberalism, I certainly dated the origins of neoliberalism, the late 1960s, early 1970s, particularly in the property market crash of 1973, which was followed then by what I saw as the big experiment in neoliberal politics, dual experiment. One was in Chile, of course, in 1975, after the 73 crash, when Pinochet turned to the Chicago boys, and also, of course, in the New York fiscal crisis. In many ways, the New York fiscal crisis was, for me, where the notion of structural adjustment that then became absolutely paradigmatic within the IMF after 1982, but that was experimented with
in 1975. So I think the origins of neoliberalism, it was not a technical thing, it was the origin of a class project. And I think it's terribly important to understand that, because many people who kind of say, well, neoliberalism is over, well, the class project is going very well. In fact, the upper classes have benefited from this last crisis in many ways, for the most part, and consolidated even more their wealth and power. And I think it's important to recognize that. And I think one of the distinctions we might want to make is, to what degree will the capitalist class crash capitalism by its actions? Well, the capitalist class does not always behave rationally in relationship to the reproduction of the system. And I think that this is, one of the points that Marx makes out of everything from the working day, but it's also, I think, very significant. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. Let me leave it there. I broadly agree with much of what Paul was saying.
Dr. Clemens, respond.
Yeah, first thing, when I say that the real wages and benefits of American workers have increased and their share of income hasn't fallen, I'm talking about the real wages per hour. So it's not like per family just because they're working more hours. With regard to what Paul Mattick said, I would like to know the empirical basis of your claim that there has been a diversion from production, putting profit in production, to moving it to finance. I found the opposite when I was writing my book, and I've pursued this. There's an article you can get for free on my website, Why Financialization Hasn't Depressed U.S. Productive Investment, where we investigate, myself and a co-author investigate this in more detail. I realize that you were one of the first people to use the term neoliberalism, but other people use it in different ways, and the conventional left account that I'm referring to is basically people dating neoliberalism from the onset of the 1980s. This is folks like Gerard Dumenil and Dominic Levy, who wrote a book published last year by Harvard University Press called The Crisis of Neoliberalism. And they date that really from the beginning of the 1980s. Michel Husson, who's a left French economist, does the same thing. Engelbert Stockhammer, another one. Basically, within the so-called financialization literature, that dating and that understanding is used, and there's a different definition and concept of neoliberalism. My other comment, though, is that the actual contradiction, if you look at Marx's text, is between use value and value, not use value and exchange value. The two factors of the commodity are use value and value. Exchange value is just a form of appearance. And I think that this is, it seems like a kind of like abstruse theoretical point, but I think it goes deep into the question of what we need to get rid of. It's not just that we have to get rid of people having to pay for stuff rather than be entitled to stuff. Okay, it's not just a question of markets. I think we need to get rid of the law of value, the economic laws that compel producers to produce at low cost because they are producing value, and time spent producing stuff that you don't need on the social average doesn't count. It's a very long, involved thing, but I think that there are very deep issues in this distinction between value and use value.
Dr. Mattick?
Just a few brief responses. Loren asked a very interesting and important question. Why won't something like the massive devaluation of capital that took place in the Great Depression of the Second World War happen now? Well, I don't think it won't happen now. But all one can say is that at the present moment, even though the nature of the capitalist economy relentlessly pushes the people who own and manage it in that direction. Hence the move by every government in the direction of austerity, and the ceaseless calls for austerity by capitalist pundits. At the same time, they are reluctant to destroy the structure, the debt-based structure of state financing and fictitious capital, to use that terminology, which was created and which sustained the appearance of prosperity over the last 30 years. So, for example, one feature which is different from the period of the 1920s is that capital has become much more centralized and concentrated over the last 50 years. Much more internationalized, or as they like to say, globalized. The entities are international and very large that are involved. So when J.P. Morgan could say, liquidate stocks, liquidate labor, liquidate land, he was, of course, assuming that J.P. Morgan Bank would not be liquidated. He said, let's liquidate other people's holdings. But it's very difficult now to liquidate stocks or to liquidate mortgage debt without liquidating Chase Manhattan Bank, or without liquidating Citibank, or without liquidating AIG, or without liquidating the central bank holdings. So,
or liquidating our pensions.
Well, they don't care about that. They will liquidate your pension. Don't worry about it. That's easy. They are liquidating pensions everywhere in the world, and they are just trying to figure out how soon they can get to it in the United States. But that's the other thing. They're also not sure how far they can go under different circumstances. In Greece, for example, they can do it. You know, people can demonstrate and throw rocks at the police, and basically the government just says, oh, fuck you, we're going to take your pensions away anyway. They just don't care, because the Greeks actually can't do very much about it. In Spain, because it's a bigger economy, more people are involved, it's more central in the operations of the European financial and economic system. They can't quite act as freely. Similarly, in the United States, they're a little afraid to actually take all the gigantic and growing number of old people like myself and just throw us in the street and say, eat cat food. But eventually, that's the direction which they move. But they hesitate. Hardly they're afraid of social repercussions. But I think even more so, they are devoted to maintaining the asset classes on which the existing international banking, financial, and corporate structure is based. So even though the only hope, you could say, for capitalism would be a massive devaluation, and eventually they will have to do it. They will have to do it, but they don't want to do it. And hence the endless pussyfooting around between austerity and little teeny bits of stimulus. You can get away with it in a country like China, which has a largely fictitious banking system, and in which, over the last 30 years, they've been able to use the gigantic amounts of foreign direct investment into China and to siphon that into the Chinese internal banking system and create enormous amounts of unredeemable state debt on the basis of that. But even now, even in China, they're beginning to see that this the enormous imaginary credit-based stimulus of the last few years seems to be coming to an end. They've become really afraid that this is going to get them in a lot of financial and economic trouble. So, you know, I don't know what they're going to do, but if they want to keep the system going, they will have to do it. But they don't want to do it. And so we just sort of sit waiting to see what happens in the meantime.
I think we're going to have to move on to the next.
I'm happy to stop.
Okay, I'd like to open up the floor to questions, but first I would like to just briefly ask 1-minute responses from each of the panelists. Is the era of U.S. hegemony at an end? If so, is there going to be what is the next rising power? Or is there going to be a new balance of power that results? Second, if not the terminal crisis of capitalism, is neoliberalism at an end? If so, what will replace it? Is the return to a sort of Keynesian model of investment and return to more quote-unquote real production, manufacturing, etc., and getting rid of financialization? Or is it something wholly new and unprecedented, or just more of the same. So starting with Loren Goldner.
Okay. Is the era of U.S. hegemony at an end? I would say simply because of the lack of alternatives, U.S. hegemony probably is going to last for a while longer. All major economies in the world, the U.S., China, the so-called BRICS, such as Brazil, and above all Europe, are going into the tank at the same time. And the United States has been benefiting from its haven status as capital has been flowing into this country to get away from what's looked like more explosive situations. Is neoliberalism at an end? Well, there's a certain amount of talk about reviving investment in infrastructure and bringing jobs back home. None other than the head of General Electric, probably a company that's offshored more jobs than any other U.S. corporation, is talking about bringing them back to the United States. At the moment, this still seems to me to be a lot of rhetoric, so I'm highly skeptical.
Dr. Harvey?
Well, the hegemony question you can't answer in 1 minute. It's a very complicated kind of issue. It depends hegemony on what. As far as military power is concerned, the US is hegemonic. Absolutely hegemonic, 30,000 feet up. So the question is it financially hegemonic? Is it productively hegemonic? And I think in many ways we've seen a more decentering of that, and I think we're moving to a more kind of regionalization of hegemonies, and we're getting regional hegemons emerging like China, in the Far East, Brazil and Latin America. So you're seeing a shifting of power, but to what degree is this a challenge to the US? Well, the US may actually enjoy these sub-hegemonic structures. So that's a very complicated question. This is the end of neoliberalism. Well, in some parts of the world, neoliberalism really never got started in the way in which we understand, especially how we define the term. I mean, in Latin America, for example, I've been anti-neoliberal for some time now, and I think that the politics are broadly Keynesian, for example, in Argentina and Brazil with with the sort of subsidies to lower income populations and things of that kind. So, it's in the same way it was a political project which had diverse kind of structures around the world, and it got deeply implanted in some parts of the world and not in others. So I think we're seeing the reaction against it is also uneven, very uneven. Is this the end of capitalism? Certainly not. The interesting kind of question is what kind of capitalism is it going to be? Is it going to be a plutocracy, or is it going to be something rather different?
Yeah, well, I certainly agree that the U.S. has unrivaled military might, which the world has never seen. But on the question of U.S. hegemony, my answer is quite different than I would have given you just a few weeks ago. I had the opportunity to read a very intriguing book that has not yet been published by Radhika Desai, a political scientist at University of Manitoba. She argues that in the financial sphere and economic sphere, the U.S. was never hegemonic. And it's a serious argument, and I think it needs to be taken seriously. So read the book when it comes out. Is neoliberalism at an end? I kind of don't go along with the whole, what I call political determinism of what seems to be the question, wherein the economic trajectory is being governed by politics and ideology. I think it's rather the reverse of what we've seen. And, I mean, Henry Paulson, right, neoliberal Treasury Secretary, but he came out with TARP, massive government bailout. So basically what I think that people who are in charge of running the system will do is pragmatic muddling through to keep the system afloat, kicking the can down the road, papering over bad debt with more debt, despite ideological predilections and all the rest of it. They're in a bad situation, and they'll just do what it takes to try to save capitalism.
Well, I'm not sure that the concept of hegemony ever was a very useful one, and I agree with David Harvey that it's a very complicated question now, so I don't want to even try to deal with it in less than a minute. With respect to neoliberalism, I believe that actually neoliberalism never really existed as much more than an ideology. So, for example, the greatest prophet of neoliberalism in American history, Ronald Reagan, also was at the same time the greatest Keynesian in American history. So I think that actually what neoliberalism expressed was this kind of being the hesitation between moves to dismantle the state's involvement in the economy, while at the same time that was something that capitalism has actually been unable to do. So just as at the present time, the moves towards austerity don't actually significantly decrease state involvement in economic activity, I believe that neoliberalism, to that extent, is people will still talk neoliberalism today, just as they talked it in the past, but I wouldn't pay much attention to it. The question of whether capitalism has had an end or not, I actually tried to answer in my talk already. I'm not quite sure why Loren believed I was arguing that social revolution is not a possible outcome of the crisis, except that I must simply have been very unclear. You don't know what the possible outcome of any period of social and economic crisis is, but it depends on if we simply don't know. The historical record is that so far only small minorities of people have tried to actually overthrow the existing system of social relations. It's possible that in the future, much larger numbers of people might be moved in a similar direction, and they might even be large enough numbers to succeed in doing it. That's something that we will have to see, and if we live long enough, try to make happen. But it's not something that you can predict or rule out.
Okay, at this point, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. There's a microphone up here. If you could form a line. Please try to keep your questions short and to the point.
Hello, my name is Loren. I want to say I'm a great fan of the work of many of the people who spoke today. But my question is, how exactly radical interpretation of the present crisis includes sitting and listening to four people who are older, white and male, tell us things that we already know in many cases about how capitalism works. I don't think this is in any way radical, and I don't think this is a side issue at all. And I think there needs to be an answer to why in your talks nobody mentioned race, nobody mentioned gender, and surely there was a little bit of a nudge towards, the family situation, but really these were side issues, and I think, the makeup of a panel like this is not a side issue. I don't feel that I learned nothing today. I felt I learned a great deal about the left, but maybe not necessarily what the original scope of the debate was meant to be. So yeah, my question is, how is a panel like this meant to be at all radical if it is made up in this way? Thank you.
These in bunches of 2 to 3 questions, then allow the panelists to respond to.
I have a double one. My first question is a fairly technical one. I want to know I think I know Professor Kliman's answer. What empirical evidence or absence of empirical evidence do the panelists see that there has been a long-term decline in the rate of profit? And my second question is the general political one of what the goal is. I mean, people have spoken about the crisis of neoliberalism, but clearly part of the sense there's no alternative has to do with the collapse of the centrally planned economies of these blocks. Is the goal of socialism, in fact, the creation of a democratic, globally planned economy?
Okay.
Do you want to let them answer?
Yeah, I think that those are pretty good questions. So, Loren, if you want to pick it up, just jump in.
Well, In answer to the first question, I'm really sorry that I was born a white male and I spent 40 years studying capitalist crisis, and it's certainly true that there should be other people up here.
It's my fault.
I'll come from a different point of view, but I'll harp on it again. I think that the question of the disappearance of the one-paycheck family, and I am no fan of the bourgeois nuclear family, is one key aspect of the contraction of social reproduction that can lead to a fruitful discussion of some of the issues that the first questioner raised. As for a long-term fall in the rate of profit and the goal of socialism, my feeling is, and again, this is a very complicated question, that if one looks over a 200-year period from the very labor-intensive capitalism that existed in the early 19th century to today, there's no question that there's been a long-term trend towards the rise of C, or constant capital, and the diminution of V, or variable capital. But as Marx shows in the first part of volume 3, there are a lot of fluctuations along the way. And finally, I think it's very important to introduce the credit system, because the credit system is something that buffers and holds up the value of those different claims to wealth well past the time in which they might otherwise collapse because of a lack of profit. Finally, the goal of socialism, to me, is, as Andrew said, it's the destruction of value. It's the destruction of the regulation of social reproduction by socially necessary labor time, which to me necessarily happens through democratic forms of the management of society.
I thought the first questioner raised two excellent points. One practical and one theoretical. Practically, I have to say, participating in a panel like this and participating in the audience is not a radical activity. It doesn't change the world. It doesn't undermine anything. This is a group of people. We are interested in the subject. You are interested in the subject. We need to discuss it. I see no reason to describe that as a radical or revolutionary activity. We might also be discussing new advances in immunology. We're people who would share a certain intellectual interest, and there's no reason to kid ourselves that pursuing an intellectual interest is per se engaging in some kind of radical activity. So I say, no, being here is not a radical activity, but it's an interesting one, and if you're a radical, you might be interested in participating in this kind of activity. Why no discussion of race or gender? I think this is actually an important point. And I find myself, I have broken one of my rules for many, many years. I refuse to be on any panel that did not include at least one female. And this time I thought, oh, I should refuse. And then I thought, well, the truth is, I don't actually know. I read a lot of the sort of crisis literature. It's my problem, but I don't know sort of women around town who are writing about this subject. In the meantime, I just read a very interesting article on the capitalist economy by someone who lives far, far away. It happened to be a woman, but maybe they could have invited her. But anyway, why wasn't it discussed seems to be another more interesting, the theoretically interesting question as opposed to the practical question or the moral question. I would say that the issues of race and gender, although politically of great importance and interest, are quite irrelevant to the question of the nature of the world economic downturn. They have no bearing on it. This is a highly abstract feature of capitalism. If you had total gender equality and total racial equality in every nation of the world, you would still have economic depressions. And if we were to begin to talk, let's say we had more than 12 minutes per person, if we were beginning to talk about the politics to which which responses to the existing economic situation might begin to frame to frame some responses. Then we would have to start talking about gender, we would have to start talking about race, we'd have to start talking about nationality, we'd have to start talking about immigration, we'd have to start talking about thousands of different social categories. But to discuss the issue of what is the nature of the economic crisis, what outcomes are open for capitalism, I actually have to say, I think gender and race are not relevant dimensions of that discussion.
Dr. I'll be very brief. Yeah, I mean, I would like to have seen a more representative panel. I agreed before I knew the makeup of the panel. But basically, I think everybody who's been on the panel has felt under very severe time constraints, having to address a lot of questions in a very short space. And that means that you don't talk in great deal of specificity. You generalize a lot. For instance, the only country that I've mentioned is the United States. It's not because I'm American-centric. It's, you know, there's no time. Evidence for the fall and rate of profit, which you know, is in my book, 3 chapters. On the question of planning and central planning, if you're going to overcome the law of value, you have to have planning, and at some level it has to be centralized, because people are getting supplies from here, and they're producing, and the stuff gets sent over there, and you know that gets used as an input for something else, and people are waiting. Okay, we have a world economy, and it has to be coordinated. But it doesn't necessarily have to be coordinated by a bureaucracy or anything else. And I think that Michael Albert and Robin Hennell have done very good work in talking about how you have, in a sense, central planning without anybody actually being in control of it.
Okay, just as a side note, we did invite in for our London panel Marina B. Schmidt and a couple other women, but they were unable to in terms of their time constraints. But, further questions?
I had a question that actually was included in the questions, but maybe we didn't really quite get into it, although I think Dr. Mattick's last comments might relate, and it has to do with the relationship between interpretation and transforming the world and how these things relate to each other. I think that when you say, well, you know, clearly in this panel, when we asked, is capitalism about to be over? Is this the end of capitalism? Everyone said no. And I think that means something. That in our political imagination, we can't conceive of the end of capitalism means that there's probably not a force present to challenge it. So if that's the case, if there isn't a force in the world present to challenge capitalism, what is the interpretation of capitalism for? And how is it that, to put the reverse also in order, in the early 20th century, where there were all of these sort of bursts of struggles and revolution and these questions, was the world, was capitalism clearer, do you think? Like what was the relationship between radical politics at that time and an analysis of capitalism versus the relationship that exists now?
Among the various subjects that you might call classically Marxist issues and topics, which do you think could be most fruitfully revised and rethought today?
Yeah, sure. Well, I have to say, in response to the first question, I can imagine the end of capitalism very easily. I imagine it daily. It gives me great pleasure to imagine it. But as the questioner also pointed out, to go for my dream to come true, there has to be some force that can challenge capitalism. That force also exists. That force is the global working class. They exist. As my friend Jeff likes to say, the workers make the world every day. Every day people go to work and they reproduce society. If they would really get it into their heads that they don't have to do it, then they don't have to do it, and they could make a different society. So the force to change the world is right there. We're part of it. It's around us. And that's why we're part of it. And the question is, under what circumstances do people get this idea in their heads? Now, it is true that the left, as it existed in the 19th century, has gone out of existence by the middle of the 20th century. I don't think it's because capitalism was clearer in the past. I think it was because capitalism was new in the past, and people had undergone a very rapid social transformation from pre-capitalist to a capitalist society. So they had the idea of such a change. I think that one key to this is the central importance of the idea of the French Revolution to socialist thinking in the 19th and even the early 20th century. That the example of this tremendous social upheaval that created a new society, the making of history by people, was something that was only a generation or two generations in the past. We now have had 200 years or 300 years of capitalism. People who were born in it now have not experienced anything like this. It seems like it's always been there, it will always be there. And that it's a very different historical position for trying to think about possible solutions to the problems that capitalism faces people with. But the problem is still the same, the solution is still the same. Unless people figure it out, they will suffer wretchedly. And since people are not completely nuts, it's possible, although they're pretty crazy as far as I can see, but they're not completely crazy, so it's quite possible that people will be pushed to the point where they say, we have to do something about this. And if they want to, they certainly can.
Loren Goldner. Okay, on the question, what is the interpretation of capitalism for? I think it's very important because I think it's out of that analysis that we begin to see what an alternative to capitalism, an overcoming of capitalism can be. To put it in a nutshell, 40 years ago, to most people involved in the radical left, the idea of seizing the factories and putting them under workers' control, workers' councils, was the most advanced notion of revolution. There were other ones, but it was the one I subscribed to, and I still think it's very important. But when we look more deeply into Marx, I think what we find, and this touches on the second question, what needs to be revised, there are still a number of volumes of Marx's writings yet to be published. And I think one of the things that has always struck me is that as capitalism evolves, it illuminates things in Marx that people didn't notice before, such as, let's take the unpublished 6th chapter of Volume 1 of Capital, which has this very powerful description, essentially, of the transition to an embodied technology that itself expresses a social relationship, the social relationship of capital. Most early 20th century Marxists did not even know this chapter existed, but the evolution of capital made it possible for us to read it. As for the early 20th century, I think it is very important to understand that the overwhelming majority of Marxists and revolutionaries at that time were statists of one kind or another. There was a belief that if it wasn't a question of seizing the existing state, it was setting up another one that would be, essentially would continue the capitalist program in a different form. And that's what more or less what did occur in places like the Soviet Union. So that's what I have to say to those questions.
Any other comments?
Yeah, just something Andrew said, take off from that. I mean, the whole kind of relationship between value and exchange value and use value. This brings me to the second contradiction that I promised I would say something about, which is that value is a social relation, and as such it's immaterial and objective. And Marx makes very clear that that's its status. Since it's immaterial and objective, it needs a material representation. And the material representation of value is money, which then underpins exchange value. Now, when you work with the theory of representation, you know that the relationship between what is being represented and the representation is always a falsification. This is true with maps. It's true with everything. There's a falsification involved. So representation of value, the money form, does not truly represent, and there are all kinds of contradictions, and Marx talks about these. But the primary contradiction, which seems to me absolutely fundamental, is this, that value is something which is social. It's socially necessary labour time, and it's associated, therefore it's about social labour on the world stage. And by the way, I don't think we want to abolish that. I think social labour on the world stage is actually still going to be significant. But its representation is such that sociality is a form of social power that can be appropriated by private persons. And as a result of that, therefore, this social power can be accumulated by a class, by an individual. What this then does is actually create this representation of value in the money form is a perversion of what value is about. Thorough perversion of it, and there's a contradiction. And Marx talks about a specific use value as a stand-in for generality of universal value and all that kind of stuff. So there's all sorts of things going on here. And I'm just going to finish up. What this would suggest is that if you want to prevent class formation, if you want to prevent the individual appropriation of social value, then you have to come up with a money form which is anti-accumulation. This is a very interesting idea. Now, what Marx does is to say the money commodities are gold and silver for a very simple reason, that they are not oxidizable. I mean, if they were raspberries, they would disintegrate. Okay. But they would maintain their character, therefore you can accumulate and save value. You can accumulate and social power. And we see what happens as societies go. So, but if you had a form of money that dissolved, that was oxidizable, actually, then you would end up with a very different kind of society. You'd have a form of money that would aid circulation, but would not facilitate accumulation. This actually is a theoretical kind of point, which then kind of says to all of you and everybody on the left, we've got to start inventing new forms of money which are oxidizable.
My money's been oxidized in a high rate.
No, well, actually, it turns out that there's a lot of this around. Actually, the best example of this, of new forms of money which is oxidizable, are airline miles, when the airlines use this. So if you could imagine something like this, and you could imagine an exchange company. Now this actually dictates a certain project, a political project, which is the invention of oxidizable money, which can actually facilitate exchange, but which prevent accumulation. Now there were forms of this in the 1930s, which were called stamped money. And Keynes talked about these, by the way, in the general theory. That is, you would have a form of money which only would last a month, and if you wanted to renew it, at the end of the month you had to go and pay it to get it renewed. In other words, there was a tax upon accumulation, actually. Now, what we've got to do is to actually stop the accumulation of wealth and power in private hands. And one of the ways to do that is to revolutionize the money form. Now, I know this goes, somebody's going to say, well, Marx objected to Proudhon trying to do that. But, we've got to get, somebody asked me, when you ask the question, what should we get by? Marx is sometimes unfairly unfair to Proudhon, okay? And he was in a big fight with Proudhon for the who was going to be hegemonic within the working class at the time. And sometimes he was dead right that Proudhon got it all wrong, but other times I think he missed it out. And I think some of the stuff about alternative currencies and so on, which when you run it by the Marxist left, everybody kind of says, oh, that's anarchists who talk about that sort of shit, And you kind of go, no, actually, we should be talking about it and we should be systematizing it. Because this is coming. And it's coming maybe by the right wing, because there's a right wing version of this as well as a left wing version. We're not up front and right up there in terms of how these alternative currencies are going to be constructed and how they're going to be used.
Maybe we can just take more questions and then this can come up.
I'm not sure if it's a political project or a technological project, oxidizable money. But let's continue with the questions.
Another labor money scheme. Thank you, Platypus. This is like addressing a table of wise men. I'd like Professor Mattick to address that less capital flowed into productive investment than financial, if you could. And for Professor Kliman to elaborate a bit about how in 2008 that the left downplayed the crisis of capitalism, that it was a sort of capital was still this kind of monolithic, juggernaut. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around what Professor Harvey just said. I'm wondering if Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is helpful for us today, if you think that breaking with the law of value is not really where we should put our efforts. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'll try to keep my question short. So I wanted to start with the idea that my understanding of the primary contradiction in capital is between capital and labor, and primarily that labor takes the value form, so labor is actually alienated from itself. So if we take this as the starting point, I want to move from there to, I think, what Loren didn't quite get to finish, which is a discussion of the current crisis and crisis in general, and the non-reproduction of the working class. And I think that, I've been thinking a lot about crisis and what crisis does practically in terms of bringing the kind of ongoing conditions of capital, meaning that the system is based on the consistent and constant like poverty and extreme depression and physical ailments of an entire class that's actually racially and gender divided for very important reasons for capital, that moments of crisis bring that up very clearly. So I'm wondering if we have this real crisis of social reproduction now that's particularly acute, what is the role of the revolutionary left? There's been a number of attempts, for example, to mitigate these conditions through relief efforts, nonprofits, etc. In my perspective, these in fact mask and make crises appear as exceptional in capital. So I guess my main question is a crisis an exceptional moment in capital, or is it just a moment that brings the ongoing conditions of capital more clearly to perhaps aspects of the working class that wouldn't see them regularly? And what does that mean for moving forward?
We'll take one more question then. Perhaps shorter answers so as to fit in the remainder of the questions.
All right, thank you all for attending the panel tonight and speaking on it. I just wanted to ask a question about some of the political implications I think that are within the issue of the contradiction between use value and exchange value that Professor Harvey had brought up and then Dr. Kliman had followed up on. For me, one of the things that always seems to come up is this idea that somehow we're kind of in a battle, we're locked in a battle with exchange value on the side of use values, that we kind of identify with kind of particular concrete character of use values, and we see the alien dynamics of the system in the issue of exchange value. And I think that historically this has had certain political ramifications that the right and the kind of conservative or reactionary objections to capitalism have latched onto this issue of the preservation of use values in the face of the kind of destructive dynamics of exchange. But it also seems to me that historically one could associate the development of a lot of the political forms that we hold very dear today, such as democratic representation, kind of universal humanism, these kinds of notions, to the advent of an exchange society in which the relations of people are mediated by this kind of abstract dimension of value. So I'm just wondering if you guys can maybe parse out this kind of correspondence, if you think I'm wrong, or if you think there's something to this kind of historical correspondence between this particular contradiction. Thank you.
Okay. Whoever would like to jump in.
Yeah, I don't think that's a contradiction. It's not an internal contradiction of capital. It's a form of appearance of a contradiction of capital, which is between use value and value. And it's really important, I think, and it's not just a question of Marx being fair or unfairly unfair to Proudhon. It's a question of whether you can fundamentally alter the nature of the system by messing with markets or doing away with money or changing the nature of money. Marx puts forward an argument, a very detailed argument, section 3 of chapter 1 of volume 1, hardest thing in all of Capital. And what he's getting at is that trying to change the system by abolishing the money but keeping commodities and commodity production intact is like, and he makes this point, it's like, you know, getting rid of the Pope but keeping Catholicism intact. You can't do it. Catholicism is a bad Pope.
Living testimony of being able to.
Right. There's a hope. Now, okay, about 2008, and the left downplaying the crisis of capitalism. This is Dean Baker, one of the major, left liberal economists. He says the bailout, he's talking about TARP, is a big victory for those who want to redistribute income upward. It takes money from school teachers and cab drivers and gives it to the incredibly rich Wall Street bankers. There was no serious crisis story. Howard Zinn, the late Howard Zinn, says it was sad to see both major parties agree to spend $700 billion of taxpayer money to bail out huge financial institutions. They should be giving money to the people who need it. This is all about, the populism of the time. Why are we, enriching these bankers, not seeing that the system was hanging in the balance? The financial system, and therefore of capitalism, could well have collapsed in September, October of 2008. But the left didn't want to say we need to get rid of the system for the most part, most of the left, and it didn't want to say that if we're going to keep capitalism, you got to have TARP or something very close to it. So it went in this populist direction of saying, there wasn't a serious crisis, and it really was then unable to respond to what everybody was saying. Capitalism had failed in the mainstream media, and people were really upset. The left was unable to say, yeah, let's think about alternatives to capitalism here.
Loren Goldner. I'd like to respond to the first set of questions. What is the meaning or implication of this non-reproduction of the working class and labor and the role of the revolutionary left? I think we saw a very good example of this in the most radical phase of Occupy, which took place on the West Coast in contrast to most of the rest of the country, where what you might call the precariat, or a kind of a pool of significantly large casualized workers began to form an alliance with more traditional, older, organized workers, i.e. the West Coast Longshore Union, and culminating in the struggle around the attack on the Longview longshoremen through the fall and into the early spring, fall of 2011 and spring of this year. What is the role of the revolutionary left? I'm not an advocate of the formation of a vanguard party. I think someday possibly something like a political party will emerge, but in the meantime I think what is possible and necessary is a network of people such as emerged in the most interesting parts of Occupy that are spreading an analysis of what the real fundamental crisis of this system is, that there is no exit short of a socialist, communist alternative to the capitalist mode of production. And as Marx says in the Communist Manifesto, the involvement in this or that struggle is not the question of victory or defeat, it's the building of the unity of the working class. And I think that that's what briefly emerged in Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco at the time of the Longview struggle.
Very briefly, since several people asked about finance versus production, it generally agrees that the period since the 1980s has been a period of historically low rates of capital accumulation and historically high rates of Joyce Colco's book about 15 years ago on the global economy. Another interesting place to look is OECD statistics on flows of foreign direct investment, which show, internationally, which show a very clear shift from investment in production facilities to investment in what they call financial services and other speculative assets. With respect, the question of the non-reproduction of the working class is a very interesting one. I would find this phrase a misnomer. The working class is being reproduced. What you can say is that the value of labor power is declining, is being pushed down. And also, not a smaller percentage of the world population, which has now been completely drawn under the sphere of capital, is becoming necessary as workers. So, for example, you can send half the people in the United States to college, but you actually only need to employ, say, 50 or 60% of them. So the others will become precariat, will have to go and become baristas or whatever, or scrabble for some way to survive, or go to Vermont and make goat cheese, or try to do something to survive. And so just in Greece, now you have large numbers of people, there are just no jobs for them. But globally, so the working class is reproduced, but at the same time, the number, as Marx expected, unfortunately, he was right about this, that the reserve army of labor, as he called it, the part of the labor force which becomes unemployable thanks to the increase in the productivity of labor, also increases over time. So in China, it's a very interesting example, where there has been not one new job in manufacturing, according to ILO statistics, added in the last 10 years, partly because in the southern edge of China, where the foreign and manufacturing and assembly platforms are constructed, are using the latest technology, extremely high productivity of labor. So, for example, the amount of labor, let me just finish the sentence. The amount of labor involved in constructing an iPhone is infinitesimally small, so that actually it requires very few people to make all that stuff that they make in China.
Okay, continuing, just try to keep your questions brief.
Sorry, I'm just going to pass this around as well. If you want to sign up for the announcements, you can sign me if you haven't. So just go ahead, pass it around, and then I'll be able to.
Yeah, historically, socialists seem to have proposed answers or way to move beyond capitalism within solutions within the context of capitalism. But right now, for example, there's someone, Douglas Millett, who's working on a project, this is really quick, a factory that produces food, no human labor involved, all automated. If something breaks, there's a 3D printer. That's outside the socialist tradition of the working classes. This solution needs no working class. With all the technology, I don't see a real need for human labor. And maybe, is there going to be a time where socialists start thinking, well, instead of having the workers take over the factory, how do we develop new systems that maybe you don't think of when you're inside the capitalistic mode?
Yeah, two things. First, this is sort of tailored to Dr. Kliman, but I'll address the answer. There are obviously a lot of different means by which the rate of profit can be recovered in an economy. Most obviously destroying large amounts of inefficient or redundant fixed capital. Do you think that there's a possibility that for the advanced capitalist states to enforce a return or recovery in the rate of profit, or are their hands sort of tied, and rather than just being an empirical fact of our era, that it's also a necessity for the rate of profit to fall? And Dr. Harvey mentioned these sort of oxidative forms of money and whatnot, and the possibility of the right to co-opt these. Don't you think that negative interest rates are sort of a form of this through being a functional tax on savings?
Yeah, I mean, the tried and true way of restoring the rate of profit is what Marx and Austrian economists and everybody calls the destruction of capital and destruction of capital value. You know, you get business bankruptcies, you get assets worth less, new owners can come along, buy companies up extremely cheaply, they don't have to assume the old owner's debts. So even with the same amount of profit and profit opportunities there, The new owners are investing so much less, they're not saddled with debt. The rate of profit potentially goes up, and that can lead to a new boom. The problem is, that's what they tried in the Great Depression. And it just lasted a lot longer, and it really put the capital system, you know, in the balance. There was radicalization, the whole thing could have collapsed. So since then, what they try to do is to prevent all of that, keep kicking the can down the road, not letting the thing collapse. We've had 2 lost decades in Japan. I think it's quite likely we're going to be seeing a real prolonged period of kicking the can down the road globally.
I want to comment on this. You know, I agree devaluation is a very significant part, but historically one of the ways in which the profit rate has been jacked up is by imperialist expansion, by what I call spatial fixes. You find, I mean, British surplus capital got out of a lot of this difficulty by expanding into North America, and you know, so there's been a whole history of going and creating new areas of capital. The other way to do it is, of course, to build new cities and all the rest of it. In other words, there are lots of ways in which you can find new terrains upon which profit can be gained. And the interesting question is, what is the mix of devaluation and what is the mix of expansion and into new territories and new possibilities? I mean, look what's opened up. The whole of China's opened up, the whole of the Soviet Union bloc has opened up. To expansion and capital accumulation. The other thing is you privatize what was social functions. So you privatize housing, you privatize university education, you privatize. There are many ways in which you can find new terrains upon which profit can be gained.
I'd like to answer that question about technology and the working class. I hate to start out with a Marx quote, the very one that I read at the beginning, but let me read it again. Capital is the moving contradiction in that it presses to reduce labor time to a minimum while it posits labor time on the other side as the sole measure and source of wealth. Technology as such is not capital. Capital is a social relationship. And in the cases of, for example, the port of Rotterdam, where some infinitely small number of longshoremen are unloading ships in the biggest port in Europe. One example of where capitalism has marginalized much of the working class by technological innovation, but it needs the value of the reproduction of labor power as its standard for exchange. It's a socialist, communist society which can strip away that value form and use technology in a use-value way.
And I just had a footnote, just to defend the honor of the socialist past. The idea of the abolition of labor and the abolition of the working class was the prime idea of much of the socialist movement of the 19th century, and particularly dear to the heart of Marx, who looked to a communist society as one in which work would be, or people would do as little work as possible, in which the goal was the utilization of technology to maximize free time. That was the Marxian utopia, the freeing of time for everybody by simply abolishing the idea of a class of people condemned to work. Through the generalization of labor, the hours of labor could easily be shortened, and then everybody would be able to do as little work as possible. But this is a very old idea that Marx's son-in-law put in the marvelous phrase, the right to be lazy, celebrating the goal that all socialists should follow.
Thank you. My question is directed to Dr. Kliman. Dr. Kliman, regarding the recent research in real incomes remaining unchanged, it seemed a little counterintuitive to me in terms of the exponential rise in costs of healthcare, education, and housing. And I presume your methods and your research included the effects of inflation. And I was just wondering if you could maybe go into a little more detail regarding that, because it was, I imagine it's counterintuitive for a lot of people. Everyone feels that real incomes are in fact less. And also, how sustainable is the stability of real income going down the road with in view of the fact that small business is the fastest growing segment of the American economy, and in terms of they often don't pay as much as large corporations or have the benefits of large corporations. Thank you.
We're going to be out of here by 10:30, so very, very
3 minutes from now.
I'd like to thank you all for speaking. And do you see a role for the working class in preserving value or continuing social reproduction in times of crisis and economic downturn?
So for Marxism, I see ways in which crisis can create new opportunities for boom, like we see reduced cost of capital. Also, this is what I'm is here now. Increased exploitation of labor. I'm saying that a lot of the one-off solutions of the stagnant world economy in the 80s, like the introduction of state capitalism to rural capitalism, these seem to be not able to be reproduced in the current crisis. Is there new solutions for the current crisis, whereas the present state of crisis, does that have future implications? Thank you. Also, thank you for the moderator for listening to the comment. Yeah. Thanks.
First, I would want to say I would like you to stop calling yourselves doctors and professors. You set yourself up as specialists. Well, it's exactly this.
That's completely unfair. Not a person on this table has called
Okay, I don't
himself
think that
doctor because we are introduced by the moderator. So don't blame us for this. I found it very offensive myself.
I'm sorry. Just stop doing this and stop this specialization of knowledge. One term that has been loosely used, I think, is the left. For instance, Andrew, when he spoke that the left lost an opportunity by reducing the crisis to the financial crisis. Has the left lost an opportunity, or has it played the role for which it exists for capital? In other words, need we not make a clearer distinction between the capitalist left and the revolutionary left? And on the basis of what is, in your view, the essence of that distinction?
Very good. Okay, the last point, I take the point, the essence of whether you're a revolutionary left or not, is are you projecting an alternative to the society, concretely in the immediate situation. On the issue of workers' income and wages and benefits, it was very surprising to me as well. But yes, in inflation-adjusted or so-called real terms, the wages and benefits per hour of U.S. workers have risen over the last several decades. Let me just say a point to Paul Mattick. There's no contradiction between more money flowing into finance and the share of profit going into production remaining unchanged. Because there's such a thing that's very big with financialization called borrowing. And that has been rising to accommodate both trends.
I just want to make a quick comment. I've had the honor of studying with all of you over the years at one point or another, and I'm sort of still reacting to the very first comment that was made. And I think that in the U.S. left, people of color and women have been captured by statist or Stalinist types of revolutionary organizations. They've had no qualms about going out and recruiting us, or no qualms about forcing history or pressing people into work gangs either. But I think that maybe, I consider myself a libertarian communist, and I don't know about all of you on the panel. I know that about 3 of you might. Or I know 2 of you do, maybe a 3rd person also. But I feel that one thing that we might have missed, a boat that we might have missed, and I'm in my 50s now, is that we could have maybe created a 2nd or 3rd tier cohort, very consciously and deliberately, of people of color and women, very sort of I know that we don't like to do that kind of organizing where we kind of recoil from patronizing workers or other folks into adopting our point of view. We want them to arrive at their own conclusions independently. But I think that maybe, do you feel that the situation is maybe arrived at the best posture, which is to wait it out right now while maintaining a sort of activist lifestyle, or engaged lifestyle, but knowing full well that in a way the cards are held still. All the cards are held by the powers that be at this point.
Very briefly, because I continue to think about that first comment, I think it has to be faced. It's a sociological fact that Marxist theory is a male business. It's like ham radio operators or tropical fish keeping. It's a hobby for white people and men. That's what it is. And there's a history behind that sociological fact. I think the very important point, despite the offense I took at Sanders blaming me for disguising myself as a professor. Well, of course, the truth is, I am a professor. It's unavoidable. So there's also a history and a sociology behind the fact that a bunch of professors are here. In my view, actually, we're not even the people who I would most be interested necessarily in listening to on this topic. I know lots of people who aren't professors, and some who aren't even white men, who might have something very interesting to say about the crisis, about responses, and all this kind of stuff. So I think these are very complicated things. You say, well, how does this panel get set up? It's partly you have to think, well, what is the whole sociology of the professions and of doctor business and professor business and the Marxist theory business and its peculiar hobbyistic historical character.
All right, I'd like to thank everybody who came out. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for participating in this dialogue. Just an announcement, tomorrow again, we're having a release party for our 50th issue of the Platypus Review. Coming up in a month, we're going to be doing a panel on the future of the status quo regarding continuities with the re-election of Obama. And in February, we're going to be hosting a series of panels on the old question of the death of art and architecture, including names like Greg Horowitz, Yates McKee, Peter Eisenman, Bernard Kachumi, and Reinhold Martin. So yes, thank you again. We're going to go out and get some drinks now. You guys are all invited.